Hello, this is Professor Strickler. This is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 3, about American federalism. And this is Lesson 14, about a national police power. In this lesson, you'll learn about the impact of the Commerce Clause and its interpretation by Congress and the Supreme Court has had on America. You'll learn about the impact that it's had on federalism, and you'll learn about the national police power. In the last several lessons, we've been learning about historical events that have changed the nature of federalism in America. In particular, we've been addressing for the last couple of lessons the impact of the New Deal and the Great Society on federalism. Last lesson, we learned about the Revolution of 1937, wherein the Supreme Court accepted a broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause that allowed the passage of a whole bunch of legislation after that, including the New Deal programs and decades later the Great Society programs. We also learned about, in particular, the case of Wickard versus Filburn, perhaps the most expansive of the cases that the Supreme Court decided at this time. In that case, the Supreme Court came up with a rule where even local, non-commercial activity, if taken in aggregate, in other words, you add up everybody potentially doing that same thing, such as farmers like Filburn or all keeping a little bit of their wheat to bake their own bread. If that would then have a substantial effect on commerce, and the idea of that case then lowering demand for bread out in the open market and causing bread prices to fall over the country, then even if that effect is indirect, Congress can regulate it as an act of regulating commerce among the states. Now, at the end of the last lesson, we had a quote from a critic of this view of the Supreme Court. This is from a Supreme Court justice, Justice McReynolds, who dissented in a previous case. Now, this case wasn't dealing with the exact same topic as Wickard versus Filburn, but a similar topic. And when we say Justice McReynolds dissented, what we mean is he said the majority got things wrong, that they were mistaken with their expansive view of the Commerce Clause. And what he pointed out was that almost anything, marriage, birth, death, practically anything can be construed as affecting commerce. Now, what we want to do in this lesson now is talk about whether or not that's really true. Whether McReynolds is right that the interpretation of the Commerce Clause in cases like Wickard versus Filburn essentially empower the national government to regulate anything and everything. So let's address a few, some may seem silly hypothetical examples to see how they fall within the rule from Wickard versus Filburn and what they do to the power of the national government. Under the rule from Wickard versus Filburn, could the national government prohibit people from baking their own cookies at home? Now remember what they stopped from happening in Wickard versus Filburn. They said Congress can pass a law prohibiting Filburn from raising a little bit of extra wheat beyond his quota to keep at home, to grind up, to bake bread for his own family. Why? Because if he's allowed to do that, then he won't be out buying bread from stores. And if all the farmers out there do the same thing, if they let Filburn do it, they have to let all the farmers do it also, then none of the farmers will be buying bread. And then that will cause the price of bread to collapse all over the country, get lower because there'll be less demand. Well, let's apply that same reasoning to cookies. If Congress prohibited people from baking their own cookies at home, couldn't they say, well, if we let you bake your own cookies at home, then you won't buy cookies at the store. And if you let everybody get away with baking their own cookies at home instead of buying cookies at the store, then the price for cookies all over the country will drop. And therefore, that'll affect commerce among the states. In other words, buying and selling things all over the country, the things in particular being cookies. Wouldn't that be the exact same reasoning as Wickard versus Filburn? And so, if they can stop Filburn from raising extra wheat, can't they stop you from baking a few cookies? It would seem that the reasoning is identical. How about an even sillier example? Could the United States Congress prohibit grandparents from babysitting their grandkids? Now think about this for a moment. See if you can apply the reasoning of Wickard versus Filburn to it. Did you come up with something like, well, if we let grandparents babysit grandchildren, then people won't be hiring as many babysitters. And if they don't hire as many babysitters, then the demand for babysitters will go down. And if everybody starts using their grandparents to babysit the grandkids, then the demand for babysitters will go down all over the whole country. And that'll affect commerce among the states, and therefore Congress can regulate it. Isn't that really the same reasoning of Wickard versus Filburn? How about, could Congress even order people that they're not allowed to close their own business? So you open up a shop or a factory or whatever it may be, and you run it for a few years, and then you decide it's time to retire. I'm going to close down my business and just stop doing it, and I'm going to go on a vacation, whatever. Could Congress pass a law forcing you to keep your business open whether you want to or not? Well, let's think the reasoning. If they ordered you to keep your business open but you refused to, and if other similarly situated people were to do the same thing, if they were all to close down their businesses, even though Congress wanted them to keep open, wouldn't that, in aggregate, have a substantial effect on people buying and selling things around the country? Well, yeah, it would, if you look at it that way. And so, again, it's under the reasoning of Wickard versus Filburn, it seems like Congress could do that. And we could go on with hypotheticals one after another. Virtually any one that we come up with, we can think of some way to apply the reasoning of Wickard versus Filburn to it. So what does this then do to the power of the national government compared to that of the states? This is the diagram as it appeared that we've been building over the last several lessons, as it appeared after we talked about the Civil War. The powers of the national government were already expanded by the notion of implied powers that came from the case of McCulloch versus Maryland and the Hamiltonian economic system. At the same time, the power of the state governments had been contracted by the passage of the Civil War amendments that had limited state power. Now what happens if we add in this very expansive notion of the Commerce Clause? It vastly expands the power of the national government to the point that you begin to wonder whether it's taking up all the powers that the states had. Remember that James Madison, when he was supporting passage of the Constitution, we've seen this quote a couple of times already in this course, said that the powers of the national government that are being created under the Constitution are few and defined, while those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. Well, the powers of national government that are few and defined are those enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8 that we've mentioned many times in this course. While the powers of the state governments that are numerous and definite are what we call the police power. We further define the police power possessed by the states as the power delegated to them by the people to bring order, safety, and security to people's lives. Or, as the Supreme Court defined it, the power to regulate public health, safety, morals, and the general welfare of the people. Well, if that's what the police power covers, and the national government can regulate at this point just about anything, from death to birth to marriage to what cookies you can bake, who you can allow to watch your children, everything. You have to ask at that point whether we really have a national police power. And whether or not that's in keeping with the design of American federalism. Or if essentially we're moving toward what we could describe as a unitary system of government, where the national government possesses power to do anything and everything the states could do. And because the national government's supreme, the national government has essentially taken over everything. Are we moving in that direction? Well, our old friend Brutus, the anti-federalist, we've mentioned many times in this course, he seemed to see this coming over 200 years ago. In this quote, he says that the powers of the national government will one day light upon the head of every person in the United States of America. He talks about specific ways that they'll do it. He talks about waiting upon ladies in their toilet and accompanying them to the ball and the play and sitting beside them in their carriages. He says it will enter the house of every gentleman, that it will note down what they eat and drink. It'll be with the merchant in his counting house and the mechanic in his shop and with the farmer in his labors, etc. Let's think about whether this has really come true under the national government's powers that they've asserted under the Commerce Clause since the Revolution of 1937. Are they actually doing the kind of things here that Brutus foresaw them doing one day? Well, in that quote, he says that the national government would become a constant companion of the industrious farmer and his labors. Didn't the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which set quotas for farmers, do that very thing? He said that the national government would follow mechanics into their shops and in their work. Well, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which dealt with employee-employer relationships and who could be hired and fired and what for, seems to have done that. He said that it would watch over merchants in their counting houses. Well, the Banking Act of 1933 addressed people's counting of what they own also and how they keep it housed when they're not using it at the time, such as in a bank. He said it will enter the house of every gentleman and note down all that he eats or drinks. Well, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act of 1938 set up, among other things, the Food and Drug Administration, which now today, among other things, requires labeling on food of all its ingredients and its nutritional information, that kind of stuff, which you can sit down at your table at any time and look at these labels and see the national government sitting there at your table with you, making note of everything you're eating and drinking. He said that the national government accompanied people to the ball and the play and the assembly. We previously mentioned, when we talked about the Great Society, how the national government would begin funding the arts and the humanities. And he said that the national government wait upon ladies at their toilet. Well, when I think about a lady in the toilet, I think about my wife with her cosmetic products spread around our bathroom counter. And all those are regulated. They have to be approved by the national government as they do product testing. And that regime was initially set up under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act of 1938. And this power of the national government waiting upon ladies at their toilet is actually quite literal. Do you know that a 1992 law called the Energy Policy Act actually sets a maximum amount of water that your toilet can flush with? There's a national law deciding how much water can be in your toilet. The national government is literally in your bathroom deciding what your toilet should be like. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. First of all, what does the court's Commerce Clause reasoning lead to? Does it really lead to reduced national power, the preservation of state powers, more individual rights, or national laws about just about anything? It allows the United States Congress to pass laws about just about anything that they want to. In what direction is federalism changing? Is it toward a unitary system, toward a confederal system, toward a federal system, or is it not changing at all? It's clearly moving toward a unitary system as the national government gets more and more power and the states less and less power. And with the supremacy clause in place, wherever their powers overlap, the national government wins. And their powers are overlapping almost everywhere now. So what is a national police power? Is it the few defined powers given to the national government? Or is it numerous indefinite powers that the national government has assumed? Or is it the enumerated powers that are listed in the Constitution? Or is it the power to make criminal laws? It's the numerous and indefinite powers that the national government has assumed to regulate people's health, safety, welfare, and even morals, like the states had done previously, but the national government's been doing since the Revolution of 1937. All right, that does it for this lesson. Our next lesson from Unit 3 will be Lesson 15, about the Rights Revolution.